money is easier to understand immediately versus the concept of hard money. You need to go down the rabbit hole a bit, and you have to have a deeper understanding of the fundamentals of money before you appreciate hard money. Whereas money on the table that you're just passing up because you're not taking it is a much more easily digestible concept, and it helps to align incentives far more quickly than taking them through the understanding. I think one will lead to the other. It's sort of like the joke that we say where we came in for the gains and we stayed for the sound money and the hope, right? But if you get them mining Bitcoin just to get Bitcoin, sell it, and do other things, they'll eventually start to understand the other properties of Bitcoin. But I just see it as a far easier onboarding mechanism than taking them through. But of course, we will go there. It's just you have to prioritize your pitch, right? Oftentimes, you have 30 minutes or an hour, and you have to cram as much orange pilling into that session, but at a digestible rate where you're not, overwhelming them with details and complexity. So actually, we don't even talk about the technology. We only talk about money usually. We don't talk about the blockchain and transactions and layer twos or anything like that. We keep it very digestible, very high level, and very much focused on those incentives for them to tap into Bitcoin.
People kind of looking at what El Salvador is doing, like are other countries kind of keeping a closer eye as to, one of the volcano bonds, like kind of how, things were going with like the Chivo wallet and other things like that. And, maybe even like the tourism and kind of the other, side effects that were positive that kind of came from the adoption of Bitcoin.
Right. So I don't know too much about what's happening with the volcano bonds right now. I helped design a Bitcoin bond structure, which I think is different than a volcano bond. It's a superstructure of revenue generating activity combined with some Bitcoin holdings. And the volcano bond is a subset of that, where you're doing mining with geothermal power. But I saw an article in Forbes that said the new project Volcano Energy fulfills President Bukele's vision of the volcano bond. So I'm not really sure how to interpret that, but maybe that is a replacement, or it's a first step and they will do it later. But what we are seeing is there are other countries interested in the concept of a Bitcoin bond. So that superstructure of Bitcoin holdings plus a revenue generating activity. So in the case of Costa Rica, they are interested to do something potentially like a hydro bond, tapping into their hydropower. Also, Ecuador as well. We've been talking to some government people there, and they're interested in doing it based on hydropower as well. I mean, Indonesia could do it. They could do volcano and hydro bonds because they have both. But this whole idea of creating sovereign debt backed by Bitcoin is still a very interesting thing, and there's still a lot of interest around that. We just have to move that forward and help them structure these offerings. But it is a way for countries to get out of debt, because the key here is you have dollar denominated debt, but you're backing it with something harder that will appreciate against the dollar. And that's really the only way to get out of the debt spiral, because if you just keep borrowing more money to service debt, you'll be in debt forever. So I see many countries looking at this as an opportunity to break that cycle.
Are kind of, I guess, more open to the conversation of an alternative just because of, the US kind of having all this power and having it for some time. And, obviously since 1971, having the global reserve currency that, maybe it's time for a change or something along those lines.
We're seeing that emerge with the BRICS and them trying to create their own currency as well. But I've seen other heads of state speak out about finding a way out of the old systems. So we just have to reach them. I think there was a president in Africa, I forgot which country, but he was posting something saying that they need to figure a way out of debt spiral, right, and getting out of that debt slavery. So we just have to reach out and talk to them about Bitcoin, and hopefully the incentives will align themselves and they'll understand it. But I would say the world is moving towards de-dollarization. A lot of trade is now shifting to other currencies, settlement in other currencies like the Chinese yuan and potentially others. But I'd say it's going to shift, and they might settle on some interim settlement currencies. Maybe it's the Chinese yuan, maybe it's something else. But ultimately, they're going to move towards Bitcoin, because any fiat money is still subject to the same risks as using the US dollar. You can store your your reserve currency that you accumulate in that at the central bank of the issuer, but it's an IOU note that can be cut at any given time. Whereas with Bitcoin, you can keep it yourself and custody it yourself, and nobody can prevent you from accessing and transacting in it. So everything is a mid-step towards hyper-Bitcoinization. They're all going to use Bitcoin eventually. I think one of the things that we try to do at JAN3 is smooth that transition over. So our thesis is that within the next 5 to 10 years, we will reach hyper-Bitcoinization, just because everything else is blowing up and failing. But it would be more beneficial to the people of the world, citizens of these countries, if they had parallel tracks going into that shift. Because if you have a demonetization event or hyperinflation event, and you don't have a parallel track of Bitcoin in addition to Argentinian pesos or Turkish lira, then you're going to have a mass exodus of people trying to get out of that currency. And that's going to cause a lot of chaos. And if you look at history, all of these demonetization events usually lead to a lot of human suffering and potentially death. So the best case scenario is countries start to adopt Bitcoin, and they don't need to just ditch their fiat currency. They can have both of them running in parallel. So you can have that slow transition, because as we know, getting into Bitcoin is not simple, right? You need to understand a few things. You need to understand some basic IT security, how to secure your devices. You need to understand how to back up your seed phrase and how to make a transaction. But for us, it's like breathing the air or drinking water. But for many people, they have no idea. And I think there's a learning curve still. So we want to see if we can ease that transition into a hyper-Bitcoinized world. The focus of JAN3 is largely on Latin America because we see it as the ripest area or region for Bitcoin adoption. And that's because of a number of factors. You have a lot of very developed political systems. You have a relatively stable system of governance and politics. You have El Salvador anchoring Bitcoin adoption. And you also have a strong need in some parts of LATAM for Bitcoin too, because Venezuela, Argentina, they're facing massive amounts of inflation at this time, and their currencies are devaluing. So if you add up all those things, then it looks very attractive. Also, you have to take into account the political turnover. So within the next 5 years, I think most countries in LATAM are going to have a new prime minister or president. So with that change comes a lot of opportunity, because they might bring in fresh blood, younger candidates that are more in tune, or they might be candidates that we're already in touch with and have contacts with. So it's hard to get in touch with sitting presidents and prime ministers, but if you meet them before, you have a higher probability of orange pilling them post fact after they're elected. So there's just a lot of opportunity in LATAM, I think, at this time. And that's really our focus. And if you look at some of the other regions in LATAM, they can adopt Bitcoin very easily. So I always bring up these two, Guatemala and Panama. They don't need a Bitcoin law, actually. They can just say, the next presidents can just say, we accept Bitcoin. So in the case of Guatemala, they have a law called divisas, which is they recognize any foreign currency and that can be used as money in the country. And of course, as I mentioned, with El Salvador anchoring Bitcoin adoption in the region, Bitcoin is a foreign currency. It's the currency of El Salvador. In the case of Panama, they have no central bank, so they can use any money they see fit in Panama. So the next president just needs to say, well, we accept Bitcoin. We're a Bitcoin country, and you're done. No legal change necessary. But the other beautiful thing about LATAM is that there's a lot of energy, and their energy infrastructure is more developed than a lot of other places in the world. So you do have excess energy available, and that leads to Bitcoin mining. Whereas in other places like Africa, they're more stressed on energy. Like I remember, I don't know if you remember, but the Central African Republic tried to do something with Bitcoin, and they tried to pass a Bitcoin law. They flip-flopped on that a few times, but there was a delegation there. My friend Seb went there and led that. But his observation was there's not a lot of energy infrastructure outside of the capital city. Most of the country, doesn't have electricity. So it's not that conductive for Bitcoin mining because Bitcoin mining is energy intensive. But yeah, like my point is, LATAM for us in our analysis is the best region to focus on at this time. But that's not to say other regions are not important. But for us to dedicate resources and energy, that's probably the best use of our time.
Bitcoin Beach, it seems like we've had a bunch of different, kind of, I guess, Bitcoin areas where people are accepting and kind of doing that grassroots movement. Bitcoin Lake. I mean, it seems like there's more of these popping up by the day. So, how important would you say those are when it comes to Bitcoin nation state adoption? Like, are politicians actually, I guess, seeing some of these things pop up and kind of keeping a close eye, or is it kind of depending on the situation?
I think they're very important. So I've said it a number of times before. You need both grassroots adoption and top level adoption. The top level adoption is removing barriers to grassroots adoption, right? So if let's take Indonesia as an example, if they say you can't pay with Bitcoin, that's going to hinder that grassroots movement, right? So you have to engage with government at some level because we still live in countries and the government still has power. It's cool to say, we'll separate money in the state, but what do you actually do to separate that? You have to engage in some way, right? Or everyone is just using Bitcoin instantly and then they have to accept it. But for the most part, you have to have some plan in place to reach that point. So you do need that top level adoption to facilitate adoption and remove barriers because governments can put you in jail. But you also need that grassroots adoption. And we've seen countries like Central African Republic try to do some adoption without the grassroots support. So when Sebastian went there to Central African Republic with that delegation, he found that there is no grassroots adoption. It was a government initiative, and then they launched Sango Coin after that, and then they flip-flopped on the law. I think they repealed it, put it back in place, but there's just no grassroots movement there. There's no real usage anchoring that Bitcoin adoption, so it doesn't really work. There's no one to keep them honest. So I think we have to encourage more of these movements and more of these little micro economies of Bitcoin in these regions because they're 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 an example that the governments can look to, go to, and learn, interact with them, and they are a proof of concept that Bitcoin can work and it can fuel an economy. So in the case of Bitcoin Jungle in Costa Rica, the reason that Bitcoin is so prevalent there is because it's hard for foreign nationals to move money into Costa Rican banks. And they're using Bitcoin to do that, to move their money in to buy properties and pay for services and buy food and live. And that is a very powerful, poignant example of Bitcoin's utility. And it also shows that Bitcoin is a key to prosperity because you have people coming and investing in the country through Bitcoin and powering that economy. There are 400 merchants, I believe, in Bitcoin Jungle that take Bitcoin as payment, and the population there is not that big. So it's a massive ecosystem on that scale, if you will. And I think the Costa Rican government being able to look at that and see that in their own backyard will help them further understand Bitcoin and the benefits of Bitcoin.